So you've decided to learn the intricacies of the different types of flowers in Wedding Witch. That's crazy. Welcome. I'm Pac-Man Power Ghost, and today we're going to discuss all of the flowers and rate them on a tier list and how effective they are within Wedding Witch. Basically, how easier does it make the game if you choose this flower? So, maybe before we go into the in-depth conversation on each type of flower, how do we get flowers? Well, there's two types of ways we get flowers in this game. There's the static spawns that occur on each map, as well as getting them from mini bosses. Every mini boss drops one of these flowers, so if you really want a lot of flower effects, you probably want to verse mini bosses on the route to the final devil. Also, depending on your difficulty setting, there is a certain number of mini bosses before the succubus. On normal wedding, you get one. On hard wedding, you get two. And on nightmare wedding, you get three. So there's a lot of opportunities for flowers, and there's a lot of times where you can actually have the flowers stack. It leads to some interesting scenarios where some are completely broken if duplicated in their effects. So now we've discussed the spawning conditions of these flowers. Let's talk about each of the flowers and how good are they. We're going to go in alphabetical order. I don't think I've missed any, but if I did, I will leave a comment down below in the pinned comment section if any that I missed and their tier ranking. That being said, let's jump right into the analysis. So our first flower that we're going to be rating is the anemone, which is this red flower right here. It increases the dodge rate by 25%. This is a pretty broken ability. In a bullet hell game, you kind of want to take less hits, and if you can avoid them by just, dodging every time you collide with something, that's pretty good. There's actually an upgrade path associated with dodge rate, and if you upgrade it fully, you can achieve a base total of 20% dodge rate. This is pretty nice when you combine it with a 25% on top of that, which basically makes it a 50% chance of the enemy actually hitting you. Combine that with another one, and suddenly you got absolutely huge dodge rates in the 70% region. Obviously, this flower is pretty broken. You'll see as we discuss the other ones why it's in the S tier, but for now, we'll leave it there. Next flower being the Angel's Trumpet. Its effect being that the bouquet deals curse damage. This flower is pretty good. It basically means that no matter what, your bouquet will deal more damage on top of its base rate. So if you're going down the curse line, which is corruption-based potions, you'll see a damage increase on top of your bouquet damage. In the early game, this is pretty nice. But if you're going down paths like area control, when you're going down the paths that are based off the potions, unless you're going down the melee type, the familiar, or the corruption type, it's kind of hard to justify the effects of this flower, as its base rate is only really going to help you on these pathways. The other three that I didn't mention are more about attacking your enemy from a distance. So getting close combat with the Angel's Trumpet isn't really beneficial past the early to mid game. Especially with upgrades, you'll find that this flower is only really good when you're going down corruption lines, because other than maybe the first two stages, I don't really see this flower get much use, because you're not really hitting things with your bouquet much unless it's a mini boss or the final boss. So I think it's pretty nice, but it's not absolutely broken, and it's only really going to help you. It helps you in a lot of cases for free, but it's really only powerful if you're going down the corruption path. Next up is Baby's Breath. which fires a projectile forward when swinging the bouquet. It sends out small little dots and spreads it out, kind of like projectile magic. This is always great to have. It's another way to create distance between you and the monsters on screen. It's really good in the early game because it just kills things from far away, as well as it never has a downside when you click it. Like throughout the early, mid, and end game, it's always contributing to some form of damage, whether that's hitting someone something from far away or even just doing more chip damage to bosses. I say this is pretty amazing. It's not busted and broken, but if you're going down projectile based magic as well, it'll get a bit of a buff. So I think it's perfect for the amazing tier. The Blade Flower is up next, which does a 25% increase to melee based magic damage. For a class that's focused on rapid damage and mostly just small area of control and basically like up in your face magic, it's pretty good for dealing large amounts of damage, but it's only going to help you if you go down the melee path. And the melee path generally is pretty hard to execute because it doesn't have many tools for area of control. It has I'd say there's 3 spells in its kit that are good for controlling the area around you, and even then, it's hard to really stay alive with this build amongst the other classes. It's still nice to have, and it's a general buff if you go down melee, but because optimally, I wouldn't choose melee that much. I say it's either somewhere between the nice and situational. But I'm just gonna say it's nice to have. With how starting abilities work in this game, you get 2 set starting abilities. That can be from any class, and if you happen to get Smash, it's nice to have this Blade Flower. Up next is the Cactus Flower, which reduces the incoming damage by 50% and returns the reduced damage to the enemy. This is absolutely busted. We use it in speedruns a lot because of how much potential this has. Not only does it help you reducing the damage that you take, but it also acts as a fast method of dealing damage. If you didn't have any dodge rate and you stood under a boss, you can pretty much kill him within a second or 2 seconds because of how busted this flower is. Obviously, you have to manage your health, but if you're really good at the game and you don't take a lot of damage, this is where you can optimize your damage output. But that's really only for speedrunners and in the context of a speedrun. But outside the context of a speedrun, it's really good for just reducing your damage by 50%. So it's kind of broken. It's probably the best flower in the game because of that reason alone. Reducing damage by its percentage base, we take that. This next flower, Charmile, I'm gonna butcher some of these flower names, summons an area that causes area damage and follows the witch. This is another one of those really nice things to have because it's instant activation and it's always going to benefit the player. And also, if you happen to go down area magic, it's going to get buffed as you progress through the area magic tree. Area magic is pretty good, and it just helps, specifically this flower, it really helps for killing bosses. And also if you just happen to, have the area of effect leading behind you and killing some enemies that are coming towards you, or just standing still and letting enemies swarm around you and take area damage from the circular area. I can't think of anywhere else to put it than A tier. It's pretty good. It's not as good as this flower here, but still, it's still an amazing flower to have equipped. The next flower is Clover, which grants a 40% gold income increase, and pumpkin boxes drop an extra gold piece. This basically means that every pumpkin you break is going to have gold in it, as well as sometimes the abilities from the pumpkins. As someone who's already upgraded everything, gold is useless to me. But when you're starting out, it's a nice way to increase your gold count. Though the impact of it's pretty small. You kind of want it for the gold income increase. But other than that, it's just small benefits to the gold income. It's pretty minimal impact in my eyes. But it does help you get to a stage where when you're in that early stages of playing the game and you need the money, it does help you. So I guess it's either minimal impact or situational, because most players, after they play enough, this becomes useless to them because they have enough money to beat the game. So I'm going to say, to the casual, it's probably nice, but for me, it's minimal impact. I don't use it. If I see it, I avoid it. If I see that green clover, I ain't clicking it. I'm just not clicking it. Next up is the Corpse Flower. Upon death, enemies have a 10% chance to cause curse damage to other nearby enemies. This flower only activates if you have curse magic based abilities, and in that aspect of itself, it has more of a niche archetype when dealing damage. So if you're not down the curse line, you're not really going to see this be activated a lot. All it does is it creates a small pocket of area where it just does a little bit of burst curse damage. There's a lot of flowers are like this. Each type of potion class has its own flower for this kind of niche. This is probably the best one, since curse and projectile are both probably the strongest classes in the game. But I'm going to put it in situational. You want to tech curse or projectile pretty much whenever you can. But even then, if for some reason you just don't want to go down the curse line, it's pretty situational to tech this flower. Next up is the Curse Flower, which in the name pretty much tells you 25% curse magic damage increase. This one's pretty situational for the fact that you actually have to have curse magic, but like the other ones, it's just a buff. Like it's just gonna buff those curse magic. And even if you never tech it, it's nice to have assurance that if you do get that curse damage at some point, you're gonna get a 25% increase. Unlike the other ones, where that creates an area of effect, you already have to have the type of magic, but then you also have to have the small chance of it actually doing extra damage. Personally, you really need all three things covered for them to all work, but it's easier to get the Curse Flower online than the previous flower, Corpse Flower. So I'd say it's pretty much nice tier in the B. B's kind of like my base level. Anything below B, I say probably only grab it if you really need it. Otherwise, don't bother. Our next flower is Daisy, which is critical hits will summon additional area damage with a 20% activation rate. Much like the class-based flowers that do the area damage, this one is pretty hard to justify a lot of the time unless you have another flower, which is this one. That one, what it does is it activates a crit 100% of the time if they haven't been hit. That's basically one of the only times that I would ever tech Daisy. If I didn't have, I think it's called the Jasmine, I probably would never hit it because critical hits are pretty rare. On your base level, if you upgraded your crit rate, it's a 5%. There are spells that increase your crit, but it's really hard for me to tech this when there's other really great options that are always active and always helping you. So for the Daisy, I'm keeping it in situational. Next up is the Dandelion, increases HP by 100, and regenerates 5 HP every 10 seconds. This one is one of the only ways you can heal in the game. There's also the upgrade path of gaining HP, much like this flower. But if you don't have that upgrade, this is the only way you can heal passively. There are other ways you can heal through the upgrade tree, as well as there's other applications like the potion bottle, the revival, as well as the HP increases you get from level up. But having HP in a bullet hell game is pretty nice. It's also very useful in speedruns because we take a lot of damage, so it's just nice to have HP regeneration and building on top of that through your skills or even other flowers. So I'm going to put this in amazing. It's not absolutely broken, but it's pretty great to have. If there was less healing applications in this game, I would say it would be broken. But with the abundance of healing applications, I'll keep it in amazing tier. Explosive flower increases the explosive magic damage by 25%. Much like the other flowers here, we're just gonna slide this in between here. Much like the other flowers that increase potion class based spells, it's pretty much the same. Explosive damage is pretty good in this game. Not as good as projectile and curse, but again, it's just nice to have, so I'm going to put it in B tier. Next up is a familiar flower, which increases familiar magic damage by 25%. Much like the previous flower, it just buffs your familiar based magic. Although this is probably one of, if not the worst classes to tech in this game, because in order to do a lot of damage with familiar based magic, you have to tech a lot of other different flowers before it starts to become impactful. Unlike the other classes like projectile and curse, that are much more easier to get online and doesn't require as much tools. It's definitely the worst class in the game, so having a 25% increase, you're probably not going to tech it that much. And personally, I find it pretty situational. There's a lot of things that need to come up online for this to work. So, unlike the other flowers, I'm just going to put it in the situational tier. I genuinely never tech it, so that's why it's going there. Freesia, which is the next flower. The bouquet has a 10% chance to deal additional area damage. So it's kind of like this flower here, but it has a percentage chance. And, it's nice. It's nice to have, but it's definitely the worst one of the bunch. The impact of this is pretty minimal, but at least it still does something in all cases, unlike the flowers below. So I'm going to leave it in the bottom of B tier. This next flower, not really a flower, the ginseng. I'm going to butcher all of these flower pronunciations. When dealing physical damage, there's a 5% chance to spawn a damaging wave. So this flower is only really good for the melee type classes. And again, much like these two flowers here, it's only going to activate if you have melee type damage. So this is pretty situational in my eye. Definitely goes somewhere around there in the situational tier. Next up is the gold tulip. Swinging the bouquet will throw bombs that deal explosion damage. Again, this is a flower that's basically an always effect, and it's tied to your attack speed of your bouquet. So the more you upgrade your bouquet in the early game, the more impactful this flower is going to become, as well as if you happen to increase your explosion damage, it's just going to skyrocket. Has nice synergy with other classes as well. If you go down the corruption line, you can increase your hit count, which also increases the amount of bombs that throw from this flower. This is a pretty amazing flower. It just does damage all the time, and you can upgrade it pretty easily, unlike some of the other flowers. So I'm just going to put it in the top of amazing. Next up is the Gunflower, which does 25% increase to projectile magic damage. Much like the other flowers that increase your class-based damage. For a class that sees a lot of use, it's really nice to have, like, at the top of nice. Right next to the Curse Flower. When I'm playing this game, I'm always teching those projectile or curse-based magic when I can, if they're really good. So this is always going to help me if I see it. So I pretty much pick up this ability whenever I can. Its impact, obviously, is only going to work if you have projectile magic, but because it's so common in your builds, I say it has a secure place in the nice tier. Next up is the flower Iris. Swinging the bouquet casts a sword aura that deals physical damage. Weirdly, I would think this would go in projectile damage, but they decided we're going to do physical based damage with a projectile. Kind of weird choice, QB, but I digress. The Iris flower is pretty good. It's not as powerful as the Daisy. It has a slower attack. And when I mean attack speed, the speed that the spell travels is slower than the Daisy's. There's an interesting comparison that could be made that the projectile that comes out because it's on the screen for longer might deal more damage than the Daisy, but I would much rather have the Daisy over than the Iris. Again, having ways to deal damage constantly, that's always great to have, so it's firmly in the amazing tier. We discussed this a little bit earlier, but the Jasmine Flower guarantees a critical hit against enemies at 100 HP. This is pretty broken. This works both on magic and your bouquet based damage. So it's very impactful in the early game, mid game, and late game. Doesn't matter when you use this flower and have the effects, it's always going to deal a great amount of damage. In the early stages of the game, it really helps to kill the enemies in one hit, and in later portions of the game when you've upgraded your spells or your bouquet, depending on the two, whichever you rely on damage, you're going to start seeing one-hit kills even more consistently. Combine that with another flower that increases your critical damage by 50%, you can start to see your high damage counts with this flower, and I can't think of a better place than broken. Potentially better than this flower here and its impact. For the casual gameplay, the impact of the Jasmine's much better than dodge rate, but that's just my personal opinion. It's probably better to deal damage than to have a fail-safe of a 25% dodge rate. Next up is the flower Lavender. When your area magic ends, so like when it runs out, there's a 25% chance that it'll activate itself again. This basically means it will prolong the area of effect. This is pretty crucial for some area spells, and particularly when they're at lower levels. They don't have long activation times. There's some area magic though that once you upgrade it fully, it's basically casted for the whole time, so this becomes obsolete. It's really nice to have for the area magic based damage that doesn't last on the screen for very long. It just basically makes it that you proc it more often. It's still a pretty situational flower to have because you have to have area magic, and this is only really going to affect spells that you get from the area magic tree. The starter spells in area magic, they don't really need the Lavender. Like, if you upgrade their effect to level 6, they stay on the screen for an infinite amount of time. So this only really helps the other area magic abilities. So in itself, it's pretty situational. You're probably not going to see this proc very often, but if you do go down the area magic type class, it's pretty nice to have. Next flower is Lilac, which grants damaging aura for the familiars. This basically means that if you go down the familiar path, there's a small area magic that goes around all your familiars. And I actually don't know if this flower does area based magic or familiar based magic, so it's hard to comment. I assume that the flower does familiar based damage, because once you equip this, your familiars start to do a lot more damage. Normally I find familiars to be pretty weak in this game, but as soon as you start taking the lilac or the familiar flower, suddenly your damage is going to increase and it starts to really get the familiar spells online. In saying that though, I rarely find this to be very impactful, because you have to already be in the worst class and you have to line it up with other flower types. So I'm going to put it in situational. It's definitely more valuable than this flower here, because it has more of an impact on your build, but in saying that, it's still pretty situational. Next up is the Lily, which revives the witch once. So as I played this game more, I find that the value of this ability really only comes from if you die. And if you die a lot in this game, if you're struggling with this game, this ability really does help, because it basically gives you, I think, a 6 of your health pool at minimum, sometimes half. I think it's a set value of HP. I'm not actually 100% sure what it is, but it still gets you back up. It's nice to have for when you're struggling in the game, but as you progress and become a better player, this ability is only really good when you combine it with the cactus flower, because you want to maximize your damage output. It's just a nice way of healing. It's a good application of getting an extra bit of health, so it's definitely an amazing ability, but it's definitely gone down in my assessment. I used to think this was pretty broken, but when you really think about it, if you're a player that doesn't die a lot, this probably isn't going to be very impactful. And it's basically just insurance. But for those new players, or those runs where you don't have a lot of damage tools or potential, it's really amazing to have in the back pocket. If something goes really terribly wrong, you suddenly don't hit damage caps, that you can't kill enemies in one shot. I definitely see this ability giving me reassurance in those tough times. Next flower is the Lotus Flower, which the bouquet deals an additional explosion damage with a 20% chance. Much like the other flowers that activate on a percentage base in a class type. It's pretty situational. Explosion damage is really good, and having a 20% chance of dealing extra damage is nice, but unless you're going down that path, I don't see you really taking this very often, so I'm going to put it somewhere in situational tier. Not much to talk about here, it just makes your explosion damage a bit better. There's some pretty busted explosion damage like fireball, lightning, so this is a flower that's nice to have, but only in those niche cases where you have one of your 6 spells as explosion type. This could also work with other explosion based flowers like this golden tulip, but again, that's still a situational flower. So I'm going to keep it in C tier. Next up is Mint, which gives movement and attack speed boost to all familiars. Much like the other familiar based flowers, it has a really high impact, this one, but you have to be going down the familiar tree. It feels like it basically doubles the amount of damage you deal, because your familiars are getting to its next target quicker, as well as dealing more damage quicker. So it's really good to have. You really do need familiar based spells for this to work. What I've done is I've moved up all those familiar based flowers, as you know, they're really great and impactful, but it's really hard to justify having all these abilities. It's really hard to justify teching these unless you're purposely going down familiar class tree. One benefit of the familiar class tree is, unlike the other class trees, there is an inherent amount of damage that you can deal without actually investing into any familiar type spells, because when you tech the familiar class, you get a free wolf, which is basically a free familiar, and you'll at least get impact from that. So I guess if you tech it, I guess you can always get some form of damage, and all you have to do is just have one point investment in familiar for this to come online. So I'm actually going to put these up a little bit and put them into the nice tier. They are definitely situational. I'm going to keep this one down as situational, but the mint and the lilac, I'm actually going to move them up because of that reason alone. They can have small benefits like these ones, but they're just harder to justify. Next up is the Morning Glory Flower, which increases your bouquet attack angle range by 180 degrees. This is pretty nice. It basically covers half of a 360 area radius, and it can be really busted. Every time you upgrade your angle, I think it upgrades it by like 24. Keep stacking that with this flower, and suddenly you have a 360 range bouquet attack angle, and it's kind of busted. Really helps in the early game and the mid game portions. Not necessarily for focusing on bosses or mini bosses, but it's good for area of control. I definitely say it's amazing, but it's not busted and broken like the other flowers that I have above it. Next up is the Nightshade. Curse magic will make the enemy flee. So this flower is very interesting because it's one of the only flowers that have this kind of effect. You could have this through your bouquet dealing curse damage or through the spells, but what it means is if you don't kill the enemy, it'll start to walk away. This is only really impactful in the early stages of the game where your kit isn't necessarily defined and you really need a way of avoiding enemies. It's nice early on when you don't have upgrades to have the assurance that if you go down curse, you can have the enemies run away and give you some space. I think it's somewhere with the familiars. It's only really nice to have, but if you're really good at the game, it's probably a burden to have. So it's definitely somewhere in the range of here. How much you value this flower is how confident you are of your ability. If you're very confident, I'd say it's pretty minimal impact and you probably don't want it, but for the casual player, it's pretty decent or no upgrades. Next up is the Passion Flower. On hit, the bouquet has a 33% chance to summon lightning that deals projectile damage. This flower pretty much just deals damage pretty much all the time. Unlike the other spells though that are like this, such as the Iris and the Daisy, this one has the least amount of impact and does the smallest amount of damage potential. Obviously it has no requirements to get it to be set up, and if you do go down the projectile damage route, it will get increased damage as you progress through the game. So it's really pretty much amazing to have, but it's probably the weakest out of those three flowers. So I'm going to put it in an amazing tier and at the bottom. Next up is Persian Shield, which creates a shield that rotates around the witch, dealing physical damage to enemies and blocking hostile projectiles. So there's a Steam guide out there that puts this in like the broken tier, or like really high and amazing, because it blocks projectile damage. While I think that impact is nice to have and it has a small amount of assurance for some of the enemy types that do deal projectile damage. This only really affects on enemies that do projectile damage, as well as the defensive application that this flower is supposed to provide. I feel it's pretty lacking. The movement speed of the area which this blocks is pretty small, and you would have to be very calculated in both your movement and the flower's movement to actually get used out of the defensive abilities. So I don't really see this flower for the defensive applications, and more the attacking part of this flower. To gain the benefit from this flower, I personally just go in a circle and have the flower that's supposed to rotate stay stationary and target enemies such as mini bosses and the final boss. I only really use this as a boss killer, and it's pretty great as a boss killer. But other than that, I really don't use it for its other purpose, its defensive purpose. It does pretty decent physical damage, so I'm gonna put it in amazing tier. It does have other effects, but I don't feel that it's very impactful, so it's keeping it away from the broken tier. If it had more of an area where it blocked, I'd say it'd be better, but it's pretty small. It's probably like 24, it's like a 24 size angle, so it's really not, you're not really going to block that much. So anyway, that's just my take personally on the flower. You can disagree with any of my takes on these flowers, and I encourage you all to comment below if you feel like I've undervalued some of these or overvalued some of these, but I think we'll continue forward. Next up is Raphzelia. I can't pronounce some of these to save my life. Enemies around the witch move slower. So this is always going to have activation. Basically what it does is it creates an area that if an enemy walks into that space, reduces their movement speed. This is pretty nice to have if you want to dodge incoming enemies, as well as if you have area-based magic. They're going to stay in the area-based magic for longer. So I actually think this is just as good as the Persian's shield on that regard alone. While it doesn't deal damage, it actually probably has better defensive abilities than the Persian shield. So I'm gonna put it slightly above for that reason alone. It's just an amazing thing to have. Obviously, if you avoid damage a lot, this isn't that great, but it does help you. Does help you in close range combat, which generally happens when you're defeating bosses. So I feel as a casual player, this is really nice to have, and even if you're really good at the game, it's just great to have to slow down the enemy and kill mini bosses and bosses. So I'm keeping it in an amazing tier. Next up is the Red Spider Lily, which increases the XP drop by enemies by 30%. So interestingly enough, there's an upgrade path that if you tech it and spend gold on it, you get 10% XP increase, and it goes up to 50%. So adding an extra 30% can really help with your general average level, and can definitely help you achieve stat minimums for your damage, as well as getting your builds up in an online quicker. Not much to say here. It's pretty busted. Getting more application, getting more abilities, getting more level ups and abilities through it is just really nice to have. So I feel like it's hard to not justify it not being broken. Next up is Rose, which increases your crit damage for all skills by 50%. Basically does a lot more damage on your crits. This has great impact with the Jasmine, but also just for your really high crit based spells. As you tech crit a bit more, you'll see a bit more of an impact of this spell. It's nice to have, but if you do pair it with the Jasmine, it's pretty broken. So I'm gonna put it somewhere in amazing. Probably somewhere here. It has a high potential and has a pretty great base effect on its own. Next up is Sakura, which when dealing projectile damage has a 33% chance to spawn shurikens. Basically means whenever you're dealing projectile damage, like shurikens, you'll have a third of a chance to spawn more shurikens. Like, that's, while it requires projectile magic is really good in this game, and having the chance to deal more projectile damage is pretty good. And since you're gonna tech this a lot, and there's a lot of projectile based damage through flowers, that I feel that this flower alone can actually go past situational and go up in the amazing tier. It's not broken by any means, but or at the top of nice tier. I think just for the fact that you need projectile magic, I'll put it in nice. But personally, I find that you're teching into projectile magic at some point. So I feel like the impact of it, while is situational, it doesn't feel situational. I'll plant it a nice tier and just move on. Salvia flower, again butchering names. On a hit, the Bouquet has a 33% chance to summon a bee that inflicts familiar damage. So this flower basically activates with no preconditions. You just have to hit something with your Bouquet. I feel this is only really impactful in the early and mid game, unlike some of the other flowers of the same kind of vibe. Iris Golden Flower and the Daisy. Plus it's tied to using your Bouquet, so I don't know, I feel like it's definitely nice to have, but it's not as impactful as some of the other flowers. So I'm gonna put it at the top of nice in B tier. It's just consistent damage through the early and mid portions of the game. Next up is the Smoke Flower, which increases area magic damage by 25%. Much like the other flowers in here, we're just going to put it in nice tier and move on. It just increases your area-based magic damage, and there's a lot of good area-based spells and flowers, so we take those when we can. Following that flower is now the Snow Flower. Freezes the enemies on critical Bouquet hit. If this flower was just whenever you get a crit, it freezes the enemy, this would be a lot better. But because it relies on the Bouquet, you're really only going to see this happen in the early and mid game. And unless you're getting the Jasmine, you're really not going to see this happen very often. And I find that freezing the enemy in most cases is generally more annoying than beneficial, as when you freeze them, they don't follow you, so it's harder to group enemies and deal damage. That's coming from a above average player and a speedrunner kind of mindset. If it was more of a casual, I could see this being somewhat okay for making an enemy offline, but I find this flower is pretty minimal in its impact with its low chance of activation, and only really comes up in crit based builds, and having not a very good effect, it's going in D tier. Next up is the Sunflower, which explosion magic has a 20% chance to deal additional damage. Much like the other flowers, much like the Corpse Flower, besides it being a percentage based activation rate, it's also In order to actually get use out of this flower, you have to have teched explosion damage. I find it to be pretty situational, much like the corpse flower. Even though explosion based damage is pretty good, you're not always teching it, so I'm keeping it in C tier. Up next is the twin flower. What this flower does is it increases your activation count for all magic by 1. This basically means that if something shoots a projectile, it doesn't have to necessarily be a projectile damage, it increases the amount by 1. So if you had like Abyssal Touch, for an example, it sends beams in a surrounding formation. It sends like a couple, and depending on how much you invest in that spell, it increases the amount of beams. This would just increase the beam count by 1. It does that for every spell and nearly every flower. Not all spells and all flowers have activation counts. It's impactful of pretty much most of the spells in the game, so it's kind of hard to not put it in the amazing tier. It really synergizes with a lot of builds. It only really doesn't synergize with area type magic, but even then, the benefits that you get for all the other builds, it's just really good to have. Actually, might put it at the top of amazing, because if you don't have a build in mind, or you just got really bad flowers, if you don't have really good synergy with the flowers that you've been presented, this is pretty much an always tech for me in pretty much 9 times out of 10 cases, so it can't be anything but amazing. With all the flowers now ranked, I encourage you all to type down below in the comments if you have any disagreements, or even if you agree and want to expand more. Look at this as more of a casual based approach than a speedrunning based approach. In future, I would like to discuss more aspects of the game, such as the different classes and their skills as well as the spells. So if you would enjoy that type of content, please subscribe, as I feel that I will be doing that pretty soon. You should also check out the other Wedding Witch videos, as well as if you're interested, my Fire Emblem analysis videos, where I take a pretty overanalyzed look at Fire Emblem units. Thanks all for watching, and I hope to see you guys again soon.